Good evening. Thank you so much for coming out on this gloomy night, but what better thing to do than come and hear our friend Rick Warwick. Rick is someone who needs no introduction, but he deserves one. So I will tell you that he's our county historian. We're so very fortunate to have him in our community to be here for us. He has amassed an encyclopedic knowledge of Williamson County. And so it's always a great pleasure to hear him whenever we can. Thank you so much for coming out, and I've seen many of you in your faces in special collections. I'm Marcia, the Special Collections Librarian. I hope to see you again soon. Rick, thank you so much for giving your time tonight.
Well, thank you all for coming out on a night like tonight and missing whatever's on TV. I promise there'll be no commercials. This is our first slide tonight. Now, our topic is going to be buildings that were here during the Civil War. And this is not hardly all of them, but it's the ones I could put together hurriedly. And on this first picture, this is our first photo, the earliest photograph we have of the square in Franklin. It was taken in 1883. And you'll see there's two buildings there that are no longer with us, but I want to show them to you. What we call House's Corner was really owned by Peggy McPherson's great-grandfather, Dr. Samuel Henderson, owned that building. But most of that period before the Civil War and after the Civil War was known as the House Brothers. Captain John L. House, who was in the 1st Tennessee during the Civil War, and the Ku Klux Klan was organized in that building in 1867. Across the street is where Capitol Bank is today, is the McEwen Corner. And that was built in about 1871 by John B. McEwen, who had been the mayor of Franklin during the unpleasantness of the 1860s. And in 1925, it caught a fire, and it was replaced by the Pointers, who owned that building at that time. And what you see there today was, some of y'all here long enough to remember the Standard Farm Store, that building. I'm just throwing this in. This is a great picture, I think. It's 1904, but I want to emphasize the monument in the center of the square. It was put up on November 30th, it was dedicated. It was put up a little bit before that, of course, but dedicated 1899. Notice how flat the square is. We don't realize that today. Of course, there's no cars when that was taken, but we have our beautiful courthouse. Behind the monument is the old Williamson County Bank building. Some of y'all may remember that. And then Pointer has taken over the McEwen building. But notice how small where the marker was placed. The monument was placed on land, and the deed when the Quarterly Court in March of 1899 deeds that to the UDC, they don't even give the specifications for how much land. It says the necessary land for the placement of the marker. So I guess those ladies could have taken up more than well, eventually it has grown over the years, hasn't it? Okay, our beautiful courthouse is, I think, one of the prettiest buildings in Franklin. It was built in the mid-1850s for a total sum of $24,000. Today, you couldn't clean the toilets for that. I'm sorry for on my computer in the office, these are very clear and they're bright. I don't know what's happened in the transfer, but anyways, you'll just have to put up with it. And during the Civil War, this was the Provost Marshal's headquarters. And there's reports from some of the citizens that they had filled the windows with rock as for protection, because they didn't know when the Confederates would come back into town. But it's a beautiful Greek revival. The columns are iron. John, won't you come on up front where you can hear? But it's one of my favorites. This is an old postcard, a colored postcard that I have. This is one of the earliest buildings in Franklin that still survives, and it's over in the corner. It's many times referred to recently, in the recent years, as the Darby Building, but just last year the Heritage Foundation bought it and has rented it to Twine, who do logos and T-shirts and those kind of things. But it was beside the old National Bank, which was built in 1901. This was probably built about 1815, and it was built by James Maury, who was a nephew of Abram Maury, the founder of our town. This is probably another old building. It's down on East Main Street, and it's always been known as the Old Factory Store. Franklin had one of the earliest cotton factories, and supposedly to a newspaper article in the 1850s, it had the first steam-powered cotton mill in Tennessee. And this is where they sold the products that were produced at the cotton mill. And of course, when the Federals came, this is also a grocery store. They stole, I think, 12 barrels of whiskey and all the goods they could get out of it and carried it with them. The Masonic Lodge is one of our landmark buildings in Tennessee. It's on the National Register as a landmark, and it was the first three-story building in Tennessee. It is a beauty, built in 1823, and if you go inside, they'll give tours, go upstairs, and you can see someone's at the door. You will see where signatures of some of the Union soldiers have written their name on what is now the bathroom wall. This is an early house, and if you pass by it on Church Street and First Avenue, you probably don't, it's insignificant, but it's really a great early building. It was the home of James Pugh, who was the iron molder for the factory. And it was he who most likely produced the iron columns at the courthouse. Next time you go to the courthouse, pick on them, and you're going to be surprised that they're cast iron, and you can see where they're put together in pieces, and they're welded together beautifully. This is known as the Rainey House. Robert Rainey built this, and he also, at the beginning of the war, was commissioned to make shoes for the Confederate Army. And he's really an interesting character. This is a house that sadly burned a few years ago, but it's set across the railroad track. And Jeremiah Fields, or Jerry Fields, John Nichols, and the sheriff of the county, Frank Lavender, called this home over the many years. It's an early building. You can see it's brick. And then there's this other one is built in an odd shape, but that's the back porch. Sadly, that building was lost to us, but it's set across the railroad track, between the railroad track and the river. There were 18 acres that went with that along the river, and Jeremiah Fields was a silversmith, but he had a grape vineyard there, and he named that his home place the Vineyard. Of course, this is on 2nd Avenue. Henry Ilbeck is a very interesting guy. He had the distinction of marrying two of Fountain Branch Carter's sisters. He married the older one, and then she died, and then he married the last one. And he was a very important man. He was a carriage maker of high quality, and he was one of the leading unionists in town. 2nd Avenue was notorious during the Civil War. Many of the people who lived along that street were not like their neighbors in supporting the Confederacy. This is an early house. This was made by built for Robert Davis, who was an early teacher and a Methodist preacher in Franklin. And it's gone through the years, but at the time of the Civil War, Mr. Wooldridge had the distinction. He joined the Confederate Army and he was like 64 years old, and he stayed the whole 4 years. And this is on 2nd Avenue, of course. Across the street on the corner of Church is this beautiful house. I think probably if I was to pick a house that I would want to live in, this would be it. It is tasteful, it is spacious, and yet it's not overpowering. It's probably built by the same builder that built the Carter House, maybe worked on Carnton, and it's a beautiful house. But this was known as Clouston Hall. Today it's Gallery 202, but during the war it was Oscar Reams, and he was a merchant on the square during the Civil War. This is a part of a picture of the first Methodist Church in Franklin, but this is their second building. The Methodist Church the first building was on at the intersection of Church Street and First Avenue, about near where the silos are today. In 1830, they gave up that lot and bought this lot on the corner of where the brownstones are today. And then in 1873, the Methodists sold this building to the Shorter Chapel AME Church. And in 1925, that black congregation wanted to be closer to the neighborhood where more of the black citizens lived, so they literally tore this building down, built by brick, and moved over here on Natchez Street and Folk Street. Great, I think it's a beautiful building. Dr. Daniel Cliff was probably one of the leading citizens in the 19th century. That is he, the white man with the beard, and the little girl at his knee is Josephine Cliff Fleming. If any of y'all remember Sam Fleming of Nashville, banker, Third National Bank, that is his wife. And this house today has been moved. It was like the parking lot, it's about where the parking garage is on 2nd. And it was moved down the street. Rudy Jordan has taken the porch off and made it very severe federal looking. But anyways, this Dr. Cliff's a really remarkable guy. Not only was he was a physician, when the war broke out, he got tied up in everyone joining, and he joined the 20th Tennessee. And after the Battle of Mill Springs, he kindly volunteered to take General Zollicoffer back to Nashville, and when he did, he resigned his commission, came back to Franklin, and he changed sides. He was our leading Republican for most of his life in town. And he was president of the bank, and he was also president of the Tennessee-Alabama Railroad. Dr. McPhail's office, you probably passed this building on East Main Street. This, at the time, was the office of Captain Tom Henderson and probably maybe John Henderson. But a great early building. Some of it's been torn off today, so all you see is that little building that sits there. It's an early building, probably 1815, we think it was built. Okay, now on 3rd Avenue, many of y'all remember this as Miss Mary Pope's house, but before that it belonged to Judge David Campbell. And Campbell is a very interesting character during the Civil War. He and John B. McEwen are partners, and Campbell is kind of working Nashville. He's close to the military government up there, and he's taking care of getting passes and taking care of people in Franklin, while McEwen is watching out for everyone in Franklin. But this house is known as, is thought to have been built by Moran, but I think it was built later than that. And then, of course, this is across the street. David King has his law office there, and Tony Turnbull. But this, at the time, Martha Maury Harris was the daughter of Abram Maury, who was the founder of town, and this was a lot that she lived on until she died. This little house has seen a lot of Franklin history because it's right on the 3rd Avenue, people coming into town from the Murfreesboro Road or coming down across Church Street. It's seen a lot. This is John Marshall's house, and Judge John Marshall was considered the best lawyer to come out of Franklin before the Civil War. He was right there with Felix Grundy and all those great lawyers at the time, and he lived in this house. Turner Saunders built this house, and then after the Alabama Territory opened up, he moved a whole bunch of his neighbors and friends down there. But John Marshall had a large family here, and Park Marshall was his son, and Park was one of my favorite 20th century person. But Park Marshall tells that he was a little boy, and the war was going on, and Nathan Bedford Forrest came to Franklin, went to his father, and while they were talking right there in front of the house, Forrest reached down and picked him up and put him on the horse, and they rode down to the Murfreesboro Bridge and turned around and came back, and he always said that he rode with Forrest. This probably, I need to take it out. It's on the corner of 3rd and South Margin, and I am almost certain this house is not as old as everyone thinks it is. But it was built, I'm pretty sure, by Marion Radcliffe, but I don't think it's near as old as the sign says, but I put it on here just in case. If you notice everything, it's got so many 1870 features about it, with the little 3 gables and the bay window. If there is an older house inside, it's been long gone. Up on the hill, what we call is Berry Circle today, right next to O'More School, was the McNutt house. Sally McNutt is one of my favorite ladies during this Civil War period. She leaves a great a bit of information of what it was like to be in Franklin at the beginning of the war. Now, her husband, James, was a strong secessionist, and he refused to sign the oath, so they were really forced to leave their home. They were escorted out of town, taken to Winstead Hill, and really were on their own. They ended up going to Columbia, and then they finally made their way back to western Virginia, around Max Meadows, where they're from. But anyways, on the back of this picture, it says Carnton High School. But when McNutt came back after the war, he established a school, and that's what you see there are the boys that he was educating. And one of the boys was James E. Caldwell, who was the great banker in Nashville and the owner of the Cumberland Telegraph Office and Telephone Company. Talks about getting his education with James McNutt. Unfortunately, that building was torn down to make way for the Berry House that's there today, where the library for O'More. Okay, this is on 3rd Avenue North, on the other side of the square, and this is the Sally Ewing Sims Carter Galt House. Ron Schuff has his business there today, and of course the porch is not there, and the white brick is not that way anymore. The house was built by Thomas Manny, who was a great lawyer, left here and went to Nashville. But in time, this is kind of an interesting story. Adelicia Ackland bought this house for her cousin and deeded it, or made the deed to her brother, Herb Saunders, who lived out where John Green lives today on Murfreesboro Road. And then later, Herb Saunders deeds it to his sister, so she has full title. But for many years we couldn't figure out what she was doing in that house, but Adelicia had purchased it for her. This is a house Miss Nell Mosley lived in when I came to town, but this is across the street from what the Schuff house. Ron Schuff owns this building too, but at the time of the war, O.T. Craig lived there, and he's kind of a funny guy. He didn't want to be in the war at all. The Confederates got him and took him, and he ran off and came back home. When the Federals were here, they wanted him, and he just wouldn't go. He was not a military man. This is the house on 3rd Avenue North. It was built by Constantine Perkins, but during the war, T.K. Handy lived there. Mistakenly, this house is referred to as the Eaton House. The only connection with the Eatons and this house is T.K.'s wife was a niece of John Eaton. So there's really, Eaton never lived there, and Peggy may have been inside, but maybe not. So if the ghost there is supposed to be Peggy, it may be someone else, if you believe in those things. But anyways, this is really a great house. It's the only hall and parlor house that we have, and it's really a townhouse. You notice it sits right on the sidewalk. You just step up off the sidewalk into the house, and of course there's the hallway, the staircase going up, and then the room and rooms in the back. Great house, but it's not the Eaton house. This is another Perkins house, and it's on the corner of just down the street from that one. This is on 3rd Avenue North and Bridge Street. It's called Cherry Hall. The Shorts lived there for many years, but during the war, Judge Hill lived there. And it's a beautiful house. After the war, Thomas F. Perkins owned it, who was Peggy and John Henderson's great-grandfather. And when the Tennessee Female College burned in 1884, they brought the students here and used this, and there's scratches on the window of the girls' names. This is on Bridge Street and the corner of Bridge and 4th Avenue. During the war, Jacob Morton lived there. He was a saloon keeper. And later in the 20th century, this was the home of Rogers Caldwell, who had gotten kicked out of his home in Creve Hall, and he came down, and he's, of course, the one blamed a lot for almost the bankruptcy of the state of Tennessee in the 1920s and 30s. Across the street, this is actually Andrew Johnston home, but his daughter Sarah Gadsey is living there during the war. Today, Julie and Doug Fisher called this home. And there were 3 of these houses on the street, on Bridge Street, and they have that great presence about them. Unfortunately, this one was torn down for a filling station, and it was at the corner of 5th Avenue and Bridge Street, and it's because of this building being torn down that the Heritage Foundation was organized, and November will be our 50th anniversary. So you'll be hearing more about that. But during the war, the Toombs were living in this building. Beautiful house, a little bit different from the others, but built by Johnston. And of course, this is on the corner of 4th and Bridge Street. But at the time of the war, Joseph W. Bennett was living there. And it's been, unfortunately, been added on to today that it's really lost its character. This little part here is a very great period building, but they've added on the lemon room, tea room, and they've done everything they can to enlarge it. The Franklin Church of Christ that you see here, notice the 2 doors. This is very common throughout this area of all denominations. The Church of Christ probably kept up Baptist too, of separating the congregation, men on one side and women on the others. But this set where 4th Avenue Church of Christ is today. No, it's not. It's where the parking lot is. But it was there until 1927. There was a great tornado that came through and demolished the other building. And so this is a typical mid-19th century church. This is the Presbyterian church. The Presbyterians started out down on the north side of the old city cemetery at the end of 3rd Avenue. And then they moved up in 1842 to what we call Five Points. And they built this building. And during the Civil War, or after the Civil War, this became one of the main hospitals for the Union. And we have a great record of that by Fanny Courtney and her mother. Those two the older lady and a young Fanny, took care of 200 soldiers here for about 2 weeks. This building then was torn down in 1888, and one similar to what you see today was there, and then there was a fire and it had to be rebuilt. But this is what the old church looked like. Again, this is at 4th of Main, where 55 South is there today, but this was the old Briggs house, and Annie Briggs during the war was one of the ladies that kind of defied the Union, and they would get passes and go to Nashville and buy medicine and things and put it in their clothes and bring it back to Franklin County, acting as spies and also as traffickers in illegal things. Anne she married Mr. James Harrison, who turned out to be the richest man in town, and in 1899, Mr. Harrison tore down this building and built the buildings that you see there today, what is called 4th and Main. This is at the time of the Civil War. Now, this is up on Lewisburg and 5th Avenue, or it'd be 5th Avenue. This was the home of John Henry Odie. He was a brother of Bishop Odie. And his second wife was Margaret McGavick Odie. And this is their home. Actually, this house, though, was built by Samuel Winstead, who Winstead Hill is named for. If you go up there behind the hardware store on the corner, Tractor Supply, you'll see the cemetery there, and that's where Samuel Winstead is buried. But he built this house, I think, about 1828. This is what we call the Kennedy House. The Methodists used to own this building. They now have sold it. But at the time of the war, Catherine Allen Doyle lived there. And she had she boarded people, and she also had a table that people would come in and eat. And we know that is because there's a letter of a family coming to Franklin during the war, and they need a place to stay and some food, and so they are sent down to Catherine Doyle's house. This is not a very good picture, but this is the Robert Courtney house that's right behind the Methodist Church, or the old Methodist Church there. It's on Church Street. And of course, it's been, thanks to Peggy and John's grandfather, he added a little of his flavor of Queen Anne revival, and the building that was across the street that we just saw a minute ago, the Kennedy House, actually looked like this before it was second story was added. Or this building looked like the Kennedy House. I got that backwards. But this is the home of Fanny Courtney, and of course she's very familiar with those during the Civil War, because she and her mother and her sister were strong Union supporters. The sister, Octavia, immediately married an Illinois boy, an Indiana boy, at the beginning of the war. As soon as they got here, they got married, and she was kicked out of the church. Fanny waited a little while, but then she married George Grumman, who was the provost marshal here in town. And after the war, he stays in the Army and they go out west, and he is killed by Indians. She brings him back in a barrel of whiskey, and he's buried at Rest Haven. And she files for a widow pension. And come to find out, the rascal still had a wife in Chicago, and she had already... So she was stuck with a little baby, a little boy, and she had correspondence with Colonel Carrington's wife. Miss Carrington was going to write a book about her life out west, and Miss Carrington died. So Colonel Carrington came to Franklin and made acquaintances with Fanny again, and they married. And he took her to Washington, and he became a general, and she became very independent. And they are buried right outside Boston, Massachusetts, with Octavia, the other girl that marries a Union soldier. Their other sister married a Davis, and he was in the Confederate Army, and their brother William Wirt Courtney, he was in the Confederate Army. So we had a very divided family. So this house has probably seen a lot of arguments. This is the Cummings house, and it's on Cummings Street and Blackburn Avenue, right behind the barbecue place now. This was the old Hendricks house for many, many years. And when Miss Hendricks died, they sold it, and it's still, from the outside, pretty much the way you see it here. Down where the old library used to be and where the archives are today, during the Civil War, this would have been the Franklin Female Institute. It was a Presbyterian-supported school, and it's hard to believe this was built in 1847, and this is the way it looked right before they tore it down in 1905 to build the elementary school that some of you all maybe have attended. But look how shabby it is in that length of time. And one of the things I found, there's always a big question. You see the church in the background, the Cumberland Presbyterian Church. There's always been a big controversy as when did the steeple disappear? We think it was a high wind. I kind of thought it was 1909, which that was the big tornado that came through town. This picture was taken in 1905, and there's no steeple there. So that's one way pictures don't lie. Because this building was torn down in 1905, so it couldn't be still there in 1909. St. Paul's Episcopal Church, of course, is one of our real treasures in town and in Tennessee. It's the first church. Bishop Odie was the organizer. He wasn't a bishop then, but he later became that. And it is... It didn't look like this in the very beginning. You can see in the steeple there where the second floor would have been, and after the war they took the roof off and lowered it. But and that was in 1869. This is the earliest picture that we have of it, and the steeple looks so much out of proportion to that little building today. But it's still one of my favorite architectural wonders in town. Across the street on 6th Avenue, across from St. Paul's, would have been the Parks house. And again, it really was a fine house. Mr. Parks was the banker in town. He was in the bank on the corner down in the square for many, many years. During the Civil War, the story goes that the Parks allowed, they took the silver out of the church and put it in the well, which was behind the house over here. But that house was torn down in 1910, and that yellow brick house where Julian Bibb's office is today was Miss Gordon did that, and then after she died it became a funeral home for many years, and then in 1958 it became City Hall. So that spot has a lot of things going for it. Across the street on 7th, and the corner of 7th and West Main, this would have been the Bateman house, and it really was, that's a brick kitchen there. This has all been added later, but that little building there on the corner, it was a one-room brick house, and that is probably the antebellum part of that house, which may have been part of the Hinchy Petway house, because it set right in there before 1819 when he sold what the land became West Main Street. They tore down his house so they could extend Main Street further on out, what today is West Main Street, or West End, as some of the locals call it. This is one of the really oddest houses, but it's really graceful in a way. It's in an I shape, or Y shape, I mean. And this, during the time of the war, Franklin Haynes, who ran the newspaper in town, was living there. But it's got a lot of character about it, and it's a treasure. This is Boxmere, and it's just being restored. The family just moved a new family just moved in it this weekend, but it was known as the Gathman Place for many years. And of course, for many years, the story was told that this large oak tree, which probably fell 15 years ago, I guess, the little figures boy was up there during the battle, and he had to jump down and get under the house. But we're pretty sure now it wasn't this tree, it was one in the back. But, you know, what's a good story? This house is another house that I've always enjoyed. The Britons lived there when I came to town, but this is Patrick Campbell, who was a school teacher with his brother Andrew, and he married Louisa Winder, who was Carrie McGevick's sister. And he bought this lot in 1858. So everybody assumed that this house was built in 1858. I was going through the census in 1870, and he wasn't living in this house. He was renting a room down on Fifth Avenue. What is Fifth Avenue? So I found out that he owned the lot. He owned the lot next door. He and his brother built the school, what is known as Campbell School. He and Andrew built that together. But he didn't build this house till 1871, I'm pretty sure, according to the tax records. And of course, this is Campbell School, and most everyone thought it was built in 1858. But as I was reading the newspapers, you get more good information out of old newspapers, and it's talking about the Campbell School is starting its new session, and it mentions the sessions, and all indications it's not before the war when it started. It started in 1867. So I think the school was built at that time. This is Robin Hood's house. Maybe y'all passed it on West Main Street and the corner of 11th. It was originally a White house. Robert White built the house. And then at the time of the Civil War, L.H. Mosley's living there. But this is the Vaughn family. This is A.C. Vaughn. And Bobby was talking about the Montague house. This guy's the one that built the Montague house. That's his family there. This is on Fair Street, and this house, Jim Crutchfield lives there today, but this house was right on the trench line that ran around the south part of town and ended up over at Hard Bargain. And during this period, Birch lived there. He was the tax collector at the time of the war, and then he sold the house to Henry Potts. And it's been through many ownerships since then. And of course, this is the oldest house on Fair Street, and this was Jean Wagner did live there. She's in the nursing home now. But you can see how it's been added to very easily. But during the war, Charles F. Wall lived there. And he was one of the old men that a Union Army was going back, or troops were going back to Nashville, and they got word that there was going to be an ambush at Holly Tree Gap. So the officer rounds up some of the old men in Franklin and makes them walk in front of the troops, and they get over Holly Tree Gap untouched. This is a really great house. This is John B. McEwen's house. He was a very good lawyer, a great farmer, and of course mayor of Franklin for many years. But this was the house to be in at the time of the battle. Before the battle started, a group of Union soldiers were here being entertained, and the girls were singing to him, and the cannons started roaring, and so they quickly got on their horses and went up to the Carter Hill to see what was going on. So, it's a beautiful house. This is the Lotes house. This is a drawing that was done in 1866, right after the battle. Thompson's trying to do the best he can to tell the story, but Albert Lotes is a very interesting guy. He comes here from Germany, he and his family, he and his wife, and they buy 5 acres of land from from Fountain Branch Carter. This is right across the street. This is on the corner of Folk Street and Columbia Avenue. He builds this, and then of course the battle is right in his side yard, of course. Luckily, the family is over in the cellar at the Carter House during the battle, and the house has some bullet holes in it. But he was a piano maker. He thought he could make a living in Franklin making pianos. He was a great cabinet maker too. He built this house, and you can see all the great carving. That very German talent of doing all this beautiful carving is still there. The staircase is beautiful. But he got crossways. It got out that he was not very fond of the Confederate gathering and the Ku Klux Klan, and he left Franklin to go to California. He took his family very quickly. He sold his land, sold his house, and went to California. His daughter, Matilda, became an internationally recognized artist, and JT has been able to collect some of those paintings, and they're beautiful. They're animals, one of donkeys, sheep, cattle, beautiful. Of course, this is a good picture of the Carter House. It's a little bit different there. After the war, the Carters lowered the walls on the side, and you can see this looks like a regular gabled-in house. But notice what I said about beware of postcards with misinformation. Whoever published this got the Carter House and Carnton confused. This is another great picture, 1899, and this is the Carter House, and this is Columbia Pike, and you can see you see the fence there. That's where the garden was, and we really have tried to get all the land we can around the Carter House so you really can tell the story. And now that those 2 houses have been moved, and you're going to be able to see by the time they get the gardens back, that'll be a great story. Yes, you can see the Carter House was actually painted at one time, whitewash was very popular. And of course, this is Everbright. And of course, Everbright is right behind us, it would have been, this is on Everbright Street, on the other side of what was the old BGA campus. Sadly, this house was probably the largest house in town. John D. Bennett built the center part of it, and then the Bosticks bought it and started spending a great deal of money enlarging it. And of course, it's It's a very large house. Rebecca was the daughter of Governor Newt Cannon. So she had money. Richard Bostic, her husband, he was from a well-to-do family, but they really never, well, he died before the war, but Rebecca never recovered from the war, financially, probably emotionally. But this house was torn down in '37. BGA used it at least twice. When their school burned, they came there to have classes. Samuel Graham bought it from Rebecca. She was hard up for money, and he was going to make a resort out of it, and he attempted to do that. Resorts at that time were not very fashionable, and so he sold it to John B. McEwen, who gave it to his daughter, Newt Cannon's wife, the grandson of Governor Cannon. And then they lived there until they got the idea, well, this would be a good place to put a subdivision. This is I'm showing you this because this is up on Winstead Hill looking back towards Franklin. You can see Columbia Avenue there. But look right here. That is the Winstead Hill cemetery I was telling you about. And of course, Tractor Supply would be over here in front. Where the funeral home is and the cemetery is today, that was the old Billington place. And of course, on up there, before you get to Moody's, that was the Merrill place. But that was all farmland. Now this is on the other side of Winstead Hill, right in front of the Harrison House, and it's looking north. So this is the road that Hood's army, Schofield's army would have traveled. Buell's army would have come down on it before that. But notice the rock wall. All the turnpikes coming out of Franklin had rock walls on both sides of the road. And over time, when they widen the road, they take the stones down. And of course, you see there, that's Winstead Hill over there, and Breezy Hill would be on the east side. This is an aerial photograph. I'm showing this to you so you all can regret what we've done. But this right here is at 5 Points, and you can see the post office and the old elementary school there at 5 Points. And then looking back, you'll see where the old county center was behind the Franklin High School, and then the Carter House, and then BGA. And then you'll notice Natchez Street. This gives you a good idea. Before West Main was built in 1819, to get out of town going southwest, you would have taken Natchez Street. Then when they built West Main Street, they closed Natchez Street, and it wasn't opened up until after the war. The African Americans had to have a place to live, and so that was the part of town that they started building. Baptist Neck is right here in the corner where the Baptist church is, and at one time there really was a neck in the road. That's where the term comes from, because 9th Avenue didn't go all the way over to West Main Street for many years. But that is, you can see the new Natchez High School was built in 1949. The cheese plant is over there, what is now 11th Avenue. Today that's been torn down and there's condominiums in there. But all that land between 5 Points and Winstead Hill, you can see, was nothing but farmland. And that's it. I think we've got some time for questions if you have any. I hope I haven't confused anyone. Any houses that you want to know something about that I didn't cover? Yes?
We're new to Franklin. During the war, was Franklin then divided between Union and Confederates in terms of the people who lived?
Well, I can explain it for you. When they were voting, there were two elections, or two votes before secession. If they were going to call a convention that would debate whether they were going to leave the Union or not. The first vote, Williamson County went 2-1 to stay in the Union. there was that little trouble down in South Carolina, and President Johnson called for troops, and the county did a flip. In the next vote, it was 2-1 to secede. Williamson County had a population of about 11,000 white folks in 1860 and 12,000 slaves. It's the only county in Middle Tennessee that had more slaves than white citizens. We're pretty sure during that period of the war, about 1,600 men, boys, mainly young men, joined the Confederate Army. Probably about 150 Union served in the Union. So that does that tell you, answer the question? The town, I think it was divided up. I think the older citizens, the old men who had fought with Jackson and fought in the Mexican War, they were probably good Whigs and good old Jacksonian Democrats, stayed with the Union. It was the young boys, the school-age boys, the ones that wanted adventure and were sure it was going to be over with by Christmas kind of attitude, they joined in mass. 1,600 out of 11,000 is a pretty good sport. Yes, ma'am.
So why did the Episcopal Church take the second story off?
Well, there was some damage. I think there's some structural damage even today. They're having trouble with because it's the tower is, and I think, and of course it was damaged during the war. It was used as a barracks, and it was pretty vandalized. All the pews were taken out, and the organ was destroyed. So that's why I think it was done.
Did she ask you why it was lowered?
Yes, why it was lowered. That's why I think it was.
The reason we in the church have been told is they lowered it and removed the slave seats in the church.
Well, I don't think that's correct, because I don't think there was that many. There was just a handful of members in that church almost all of the 19th century, and there wasn't that many slaves that were going to the church. Even the Perkins were the biggest family, and those slaves weren't baptized until right before the war. So I don't think that has anything to do with it. I think that's, yes.
Buildings that were more than one story, how did they get their structural strength? Was it all wood timbers?
It depends. Most of the buildings that have survived are brick, and they all have a good limestone foundation. All of Middle Tennessee, right underneath is a good shelf of limestone, and then you get a good stonemason, and then you build the brick on that.
How did they get the second support for the second story? I noticed some of the houses you showed had 4 or 3 windows on the first floor and
Yeah.
2 on the second floor.
Well, that may have just been for, I don't know about why that would, because a lot of those that have those, sometimes they're 5 bays, there's 2 windows up, 2 down, and then in the center, and then 2 on the other room. I think they knew pretty much how to build 2- and 3-story houses. Yes, Bob.
Back during that period, would this have been largely a cotton economy?
There were a lot of cotton. It was going out right after the Civil War. Cotton, just the market dropped to nothing. But however, as late as 1860, you look on that 1878 map, there's cotton gins all over this county. So there must have been some people still growing it. But cotton had worn out the land, those people that grew it to any extent, because it'll really sap the strength out of the soil. By that time, we were a grain economy, I would think. We were growing corn. And then when the railroad came in, you see, we could really sell our produce to a wider market. And so we were producing wheat, corn, millet in great quantities after the war. Matter of fact, we were the leaders in the state. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Is there much tobacco raised?
Yes, they were raising tobacco here. If you'll read in the 1860, 70, and 80 agricultural census, there were some farms that were growing some large tobacco. It really didn't get too good though until about the 1920s and 30s. The Jewell brothers came in here from Kentucky, and they had the warehouses. Even though the locals had a wirehouse and bringing buyers in, and then it went on in until just the last few years when the government, quit supporting them and people quit smoking. Any other? Yes, ma'am.
Is the definition of antebellum
Mhm.
mean?
It's Latin, means before the war, before the conflict. So I'll never forget the first year I did was a librarian out at Kittrell School, and I had an 8th grade homeroom. You had to do that kind of stuff. But this little girl came in, was in my homeroom, and the social studies teacher had assigned them to look up words in the library, and she came to me and she said she wanted a book on Antebellum, and she thought it was she thought it was a woman. Yes.
Are there any books that you can recommend that cover the topic and photograph that you discussed tonight?
Yes. If you can get your hands on, you can go to the library and check it out. Miss Bowman is really the only one that has produced a history so far of the old homes and sites, as she called it, Williamson County Old Homes and Sites, and that was printed in '71. You can still get that book, and she really does cover these antebellum homes if you want for the whole county. There's another book, Heritage of Grandeur, that was done back in the '80s. Jim Crutchfield and Dick Ezell. They have some nice color photographs and a little bit of write-up, and it's a green book, and it's out of print, but you can probably find a copy. That's something that needs to be done. One fault I find with Miss Bowman's book is most all the people she deals with are the planter class. There's very few yeoman people. Their farms, the small farms, are not covered as much. And that's just because she was interested in the big homes and the big farms. But somebody needs to go back and pick that up. Any other questions? Well, this has been a delight. You all get home and have supper. We'll do this again sometime. Peggy, I'm so glad you came.
It's all, it's late, but I'm so glad there was a seat on the front row.